Thank you for joining us for the annual Zelman Cowen Oration, to be delivered this evening by the Honourable Ken Hayne in what is certainly a very different format from previous years. Apologies for the delay in the commencement, and thank you for your patience. We just had a few technical problems connecting Ken Hayne to the technology, and he will be joining us through his phone rather than through his computer, but I assure you, we have a very good image and he's coming through loud and clear. So thank you again for your patience. My name's Peter Dawkins. I'm the Vice Chancellor and President of Victoria University, and I will be your host this evening. And I always look forward to the Cowen Centre Oration as a very special event in the Victoria University calendar. To mark the occasion, at the time when many, including myself, are working from home, I've donned a suit and tie tonight, which is quite an unusual experience in this environment, and it's the first time I've done it for some months, but it seemed appropriate amongst such distinguished guests on such a special occasion. Before we begin the formalities, I have a few housekeeping and technical points. Tonight's oration will be delivered in a webinar format. You can see the presenter and screen, but nobody will be able to see or hear you. We recommend you click the gallery view button on the top right of your screen to switch to speaker view. This will ensure your screen focuses on the active speaker. Please make general comments and seek technical support from staff via the chat. So just to show that you are able to use the chat, perhaps you'd like to use it now and comment on where you're joining us from, because I know that you have we have many people coming from many different places tonight for this very special occasion. You can submit questions for the speaker throughout the talk using the Q&A function. You can also upvote other attendees' questions, and we'll get to those at the end. Finally, this session is being recorded and will be shared with you, as well as those who could not make it tonight. Moving to the formalities, I acknowledge that as we're meeting virtually, we are all in different locations, but for all of us, the land on which we find ourselves is a place of age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation, and renewal. And Indigenous people's living culture has a unique role in the life of all of our regions. I'd personally like to acknowledge the ancestors, elders, and families of the Boonwurrung and the Woiwurrung of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of university land and of the land on which I'm speaking from today. As we share our own knowledge within and outside of the university, may we pay respect to the deep knowledge embedded within the Aboriginal community and their ownership of country. As this webinar is taking place during COVID-19, I'd also like to acknowledge the impact of COVID on communities locally and globally and the debt we owe to those working on the front line. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all, and thank you for taking this time to join us this evening. In particular, I do really want to warmly welcome Lady Cowen, who's joining us, a great friend of Victoria University and members of the Cowen family. It's wonderful to have you with us. Named in honour of Sir Zelman Cowen, the Cowen Centre at Victoria University works with courts, government, schools and Victoria's culturally diverse communities to, in Sir Zelman Cowen's words, enhance community understanding of the law and deepen the legal profession's understanding of community issues. And I wish to thank the Cowen family for your continuing support of the Centre and Victoria University. Unlike an in-person event, we're not going to name our VIPs individually, as you may prefer to keep your presence private. We are, although feel free to, all of our distinguished guests to enter the chat function, submit questions and identify you, because it is wonderful that you're all here with us. We are lucky to have among us VIPs, including judges and other senior members of the legal profession, members of Parliament, and even one head of state, heads of government agencies, Sir Zelman Cowen Centre Advisory Board members, adjunct professors, and fellows and members of the senior leadership team of Victoria University. Thank you for joining us virtually for this special event. Given the times, we are even more acutely aware of how significant trust is at a local, national and global level. how to earn public trust, and how to keep it are critical questions across all domains, including, of course, the justice system and the courts. And tonight, we are very privileged to hear from the Honourable Ken Hayne, ACQC, the former Justice of the High Court of Australia and most recently the Commissioner conducting the Royal Commission into misconduct in the banking, superannuation and financial services industry. Until June 2015, Ken Hayne was a Justice of the High Court of Australia, having been appointed to that court in September 1997. At the time of his appointment, Ken was a judge of the Court of Appeal of Victoria, having been appointed one of the foundation judges of the court in 1995. Ken graduated in Arts and Law from the University of Melbourne as a Bachelor of Civil Law from the University of Oxford. He was elected Rhodes Scholar for Victoria in 1969. He joined the Victorian Bar in 1971, was appointed Queen's Counsel for Victoria in 1984. He practiced in state and federal courts, principally in commercial, constitutional and general civil matters. Since late 2015, Ken has been a judge of the Abu Dhabi Global Market Courts. Between December 2017 and February 2019, he conducted the Royal Commission into misconduct in the banking, superannuation and financial services industry. He was appointed a companion in the General Division of the Order of Australia in 2002. He's an honorary fellow of the Exeter College, Oxford, and an honorary professorial fellow at Melbourne Law School at the University of Melbourne. In 2016, he was admitted to the degree of Doctor of Laws honoris causa in the University. This record crowd of over 300 participants tonight is waiting, I know, with great anticipation to hear Ken's reflections on the topic of trust, confidence, and public institutions. I can think of no one better to talk to us on this topic at this time. Ken, may I welcome you to the virtual stage to deliver the 2020 Sir Zelman Cowen Oration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor. So, Vice-Chancellor, Lady Cowen, ladies and gentlemen, I began to write what I would say tonight long before COVID-19 burst upon the world. Those days seem now so very far away, but they're not. And the issues that confronted us then about trust, confidence and public institutions have not gone away. I hope that we may come through the challenges of the present times with respect for the way in which governments and our society responded to those challenges. I hope that all our public institutions and our society more generally learn from and implement the lessons of these times. But what we learn remains to be seen. In Australia, our governments and our society more generally have so far responded to the pandemic without significant partisan division. There's been general agreement about the nature of the threat we face and the need for a united response. General agreement of this kind is rarely found. It remains critically important then to understand not only what we can learn from these times, but also how and why trust and confidence in public institutions had reached the point it had before the pandemic struck. The pandemic has tested all political leaders in every country. Countries whose leaders told their people the truth, whose leaders sought trust and confidence by having trust and confidence in their people, have done so much better than countries whose leaders did not. Countries whose leaders did not tell the truth have suffered great harm. The lesson seems obvious, but will it be learned? Will our responses to the pandemic be treated as extraordinary responses to extraordinary times, which either can't or shouldn't be applied to other times and other issues? Will we return to politics as normal? And if we did, what would be wrong with that? In recent times, I've tended to focus upon three issues that press upon us all: whether our democratic institutions are operating as they should, Indigenous recognition and understanding, and climate change. Many would say there is a fourth, equally pressing and important issue to consider about how Australia and the Western liberal democracies more generally deal with and respond to China in a way that will preserve national sovereignty and protect vital national interests. But in this address, I'll leave this issue aside, as I will explain the three issues upon which I focus: democratic institutions, Indigenous recognition and understanding, and climate change are connected. They are connected because all of them illustrate what would be wrong with returning to politics as normal. They are connected because all of them illustrate how hard it has been in recent years to have a respectful and reasoned debate about issues that divide us. Instead, reasoned debate about policy was supplanted by 3 or 4 word slogans. Political and other commentary focused upon what divides us rather than what unites us. Trust in institutions, both governmental and private, has been damaged, even destroyed. Before COVID, our future was framed as some return to an imaginary glorious past when the issues that now beset us had not arisen. Now, our future seems to be framed as return to a glorious past thought to have existed before COVID. But is that what we should seek to return to? A time when trust in institutions, governmental and private, had been damaged or destroyed, when slogans replaced reasoned debate. Slogans supplanting reasoned debate about policy may go some way to explaining why, in recent years, difficult issues of public policy have often been referred to royal commissions and other external inquiries. Those bodies generate reports that are, or should be, independent and reasoned. Frequent use of independent commissions of inquiry may suggest that governmental structures can now deal effectively only with the immediate emergency and cannot deal with the larger issues that face us. One reason that may be so is that, as I've said, the space left by the absence of reasoned debate is filled with slogans coined by partisan participants. And this happens even where the basic information on which reasoned debate would be based is freely available to the whole community. We have seen the space that should have been filled with reasoned debate, filled with slogans in other countries, and I consider some examples in my written paper. Here in Australia, we've seen the proposal for an Indigenous voice that emerged from the Uluru Statement from the Heart, caricatured as a claim to a third House of Parliament. As Murray Gleeson, formerly Chief Justice of Australia, rightly said, what is proposed is a voice to Parliament, not a voice in Parliament. And describing what is sought as a third House of Parliament may be a convenient slogan for opponents of the proposal, but it is simply false. The voice would advise Parliament. It would have no power to take any legislative step. The Parliament would prescribe the structure, composition and functions of the voice. The Parliament could change any or all of those elements at any time and from time to time. What would appear in the Constitution would be the minimum requirements necessary to guarantee its continued existence and its essential characteristics. Yet still, we hear this description of the voice as a third house, peddled by those who oppose responding to the statement from the heart. Similar levels of sloganeering and peddling of false and misleading ideas can be seen throughout this country's response to climate-related issues. Still, we see climate change portrayed as a matter of ideological belief, rather than as a matter of scientific observation and extrapolation. Climate change remains part of continuing culture wars. Those who had the temerity to point out the connections between climate change, extreme weather events and changing bushfire patterns when Eastern Australia suffered unusually early and very destructive bushfires in November last year, were then seen as contributing to those culture wars. Perhaps the horrific fires of January this year have brought about some change in public perception. Perhaps the pandemic has shown the importance of scientific observation. Perhaps the pandemic has shown that science does not have all the answers, but provides the best light we have to see our way through to safety. We shall see. Now, several different threads can be seen as joining these observations. At their core, however, lies an unwillingness to grapple with truth. In November last year, I heard the Chancellor of Oxford, sometime Governor of Hong Kong, Lord Patton, speak on political leadership. Of the many matters he discussed, I mention only one. He said that it is always necessary to distinguish between power, title, and leadership. A person may have large and important powers, but having power does not make the holder a leader. Holding an office will give the holder the title of that office, but having that title, even of one of the great offices of state, does not make the holder a leader. What makes a leader is the will and the ability to walk ahead of others along the path chosen by the leader and have others follow the leader along that path, no matter whether the path or steps along it are familiar and comfortable. To do that, the leader must teach. Explain to those who follow why the leader walks this path, why others should follow. If leaders are to lead, they must teach why they take the path they would have us follow. At first blush, this appears to entail that leaders must grapple with the truth. How else could they explain why they want followers to go down their path? And yet we know that this is not so. Nativist populist leaders have come to the prominence they now occupy by endless repetition of slogans accompanied too often by repeatedly denying the undeniable and shouting down those who would speak truth to power. So if a thread that joins the subjects I have mentioned is an unwillingness to grapple with truth, what are we to do? Nativist populism founded in slogans and denial has succeeded elsewhere. Why would it not succeed here? Those who will not now grapple with the truth will not do that until they feel compelled to do so by those upon whom they depend for success. Those who now resort to slogans and untruths will continue to rely upon those tactics until they feel that those upon whom they depend for success require them to abandon those tactics and engage with issues through reasoned and respectful debate. But how can we begin to do that in the age of social media and a perpetual news cycle? If I am right to ask whether trust in institutions of government as well as trust in other systemically important institutions has been damaged, rebuilding that trust will not be easy. If members of the community no longer trust the beneficial intent or the competence of governments and the public sector, how can that trust be restored in the age of social media and a perpetual news cycle? All of us must play our part. To do that, we must value and strengthen our institutions of government. If those within the institutions of government do not grapple with the truth, others must. If those within the institutions of government seek to lead by resort only to slogans, others must do whatever can be done to provide reasoned and respectful debate based in truth for all to see and judge. And we must not be content with hearing only what we want to hear. We must recognise how uncomfortable the truth can be. None of this is easy. It's not easy because everyone seeks simplicity. None of us wants to be told only that there's a problem and the problem is very difficult. All of us seek solutions. And simple explanations or solutions are so much more persuasive and easier to convey than complex explanations or solutions. All of us want to be presented with some solution that allows us not to think about the problem anymore. Hence, to say that a proposal will achieve or help achieve some universally desired end is deeply appealing to the listener. It tells the listener what that person wants to hear. But when a slogan is used, what is not explained is how or why the proposal will have that desired result. And omitting that connecting middle step can amplify mistrust and doubt. So how do we set about strengthening our institutions of government? How do we persuade those who seek or hold political office that they must grapple with truth? How do we persuade ourselves and others to hear what we do not want to hear because it challenges us to look again at our beliefs or preconceptions? The first and most obvious step is to insist upon absolute honesty and integrity of those who hold office in the institutions of government, elected or not. And that requires imposing appropriate consequences on any who depart from those standards. As a society, we cannot tolerate the emergence or continuation of a belief within or outside our institutions of government that bending the truth or being economical with the truth is normal and acceptable behaviour. To accept it is to embed mistrust. We, as individual members of society, have to do whatever is within our power to reinforce the importance of maintaining those standards. Transparent honesty and integrity are necessary but not sufficient conditions for maintaining and restoring trust in our democratic institutions. The public will not trust our democratic institutions unless persuaded that what the political branches of government do is relevant and important and is done properly. Relevance and importance are too often lost in the fog of partisan rhetoric. Issues are framed in ways that obscure what is at stake by suggesting that only one answer is possible. And what follows is a dialogue of the deaf, in which no side of the debate dares admit that there is a case for and a case against the course of action proposed. Those who see political dialogue in tribal terms may be content with, even reassured by this one-dimensional view of life. Those who seek relevance and importance in our democratic institutions are unlikely to find any satisfaction in it. And lack of satisfaction breeds distrust and disengagement. Distrust and disengagement eat away at the heart of democratic institutions. Calling for an end to sloganeering and seeking to explain why it is corrosive of trust in and respect for democratic institutions is of little value unless the call is heeded. And as I've said, calls of this kind will not be heeded unless those who seek or hold office are persuaded that electors demand more than slogans. Slogans seek to simplify issues and their solution. A slogan will almost always be cast in terms that command universal agreement. That is why we hear that we are keeping our economy strong or supporting working families. After all, who would not want to keep our economy strong or support working families? But dig a little deeper and the slogan begins to lose its substance. What does it really mean to say, get Brexit done? These are terms that are devoid of content, and the connection between the proposal and whatever substance the slogan has becomes even harder to see. The listener cannot judge how the proposal will advance whatever general goal is wrapped up in it. And the listener is left to evaluate the proposal without any statement of how or why it advances the good of society. Instead, the listener is asked to make an act of faith, to accept the slogan at face value without demonstration that the proposal really is for the general good. Now, presenting an argument clearly and simply is a difficult art. Showing how and why a particular proposal will advance the general good of society is especially difficult. That difficulty is magnified when the argument reveals that choices have had to be made between competing considerations. And there are very few policy choices available to government that have no competing possibility. On issues of the kind I mentioned earlier, Indigenous recognition and voice, climate change and responding to changes in the geopolitical dynamics in our immediate region, those who lead must educate. And if they will not, others must take on that task. More than anything, it is necessary to teach and to keep teaching some basic truths. And it's necessary to trust the listener to discriminate between arguments. That is, trust and confidence must flow both ways, from the people to the institutions of government, and from those who occupy office in government to the people. Let me give an example of what I mean. Issues about Indigenous recognition and voice must begin from truths that are undeniable. Aboriginal peoples have inhabited this land for more than 60,000 years. European settlement and assertion of sovereignty brought dispossession, often violent dispossession. Mr. Gerard Brennan said in Mabo, their dispossession underwrote the development of the nation. Dispossession brought disempowerment and entrenched disadvantage. Disempowerment and entrenched disadvantage persist. It is upon these truths that debate about recognition and voice must proceed, not spurious references to a third chamber of the Parliament, not generalised references to equality, not by dismissal of all forms of proposal as racially based. Again, let me explain what I mean by generalised references to equality and dismissing proposals as racially based. In his address about recognition in accordance with the Constitution, Murray Gleeson made 2 points about equality and race that I consider unanswerable. They were unanswerable because they were based in the truths I have identified. First, he said that it has been suggested that it is divisive to treat Indigenous people in a special way. The division between Indigenous people and others in this land was made in 1788. It was not made by the Indigenous people. If it were fair to regard Indigenous people as merely one of the many minority groups that can be identified in the complex pattern of our social structure, and a very small group of that, then it would be reasonable to leave them to make their own way as contesting participants in the ordinary democratic process. But that would take dispossession to its logical and unattractive conclusion. The second point he made about race and racism is closely related. It is that the history of the 20th century demonstrated the evil of racism. And race itself is a concept based on insecure conceptual foundations. It does not follow, however, that the term is unmentionable or that any governmental action predicated upon race must be wrong. It has a firm footing in the Constitution. That firm footing was the result of the 1967 referendum that amended 51(26) of the Constitution. And it was the Constitution that, in the language of its time, referred to the Indigenous peoples as the Aboriginal race. Dig further, and reference to race in this context is revealed as no more than a rhetorical device of condemnation. It is an appeal to ignore history. It is to say that our Constitution as it stands and our future constitutional arrangements must ignore the fact that the Indigenous peoples of this nation had been here for tens of thousands of years before European settlers arrived. And to ignore that fact is to return to the now long discredited and discarded fiction that Australia was terra nullius when European settlers arrived. So notice then how the points made about equality and race are related to the truths I have mentioned. That is, notice that the argument made in support of an Indigenous voice to Parliament is based on premises that are stated and are premises which reveal the infirmity of contrary contention. Contrast that kind of argument with one which consists only of repeating one or more slogans about race and equality. Recognise that the appeal to supposed racism is misleading. There remains a further and critical issue to expose and consider. In November last year, Lord Sales of the United Kingdom Supreme Court spoke about algorithms, artificial intelligence and the law. In that speech, he spoke of the tech world placing democracy under pressure. He identified what he called a fracturing of the public space and its substitution by highly particularistic echo chamber silos of like-minded individuals who reinforce each other's views and never have to engage or compromise with the conflicting views of others. As a result, he said, we've lost the means of generating broad consensus about fundamental values and what can be regarded as fact. Lord Sales was surely right to say that we need to find ways of reconstituting a common public space. Only then can we hope to emerge from our separate echo chambers and obtain consensus about values and facts. Now, I have no ready-made solution to offer to the problem. We must face the fact of social media, and that means facing the fact of targeted messaging, politically and otherwise. Perhaps our lost common public space will have to be built by using social media to aggregate commentary, but the challenges then will be first to do that in a way that allows the user to distinguish between argument about the issue and bare statements of disagreement or abuse, and second, to do it in a way that attracts the attention of more than those who search only for reinforcement of some predetermined view adopted as an article of faith. But maybe, just maybe, the pandemic has given us a glimpse of two things. That we can engage in a common public space on the basis of shared values and facts, and how we did it. Governments have had to explain why they have taken the steps they have. They have used every available means of communication. Health and economic considerations seem to pull in opposite directions. There are many uncertainties. The steps taken affect everyone. Many have lost their jobs and income. The disease is highly contagious and very dangerous. All of us, some more than others, think or hope that we're bulletproof and are reluctant to accept radical changes to the way we live and work. But governments have very quickly made radical changes in the ways we live and work. And they've done that by telling society the facts as simply and clearly as they can. In telling those facts, governments have repeatedly acknowledged the limits of their knowledge. This is a new disease. science has much still to learn about its transmission, its effects, what can be done to reduce the harm that it brings. But society has responded to being trusted with the facts that are known and has recognised that difficult judgments have had to be made. And government has brought about great changes so that together we can pursue shared purposes. No matter how we try to create a common public space, we must continue to insist upon the framing of arguments about policy by reference to values and facts. We must continue to insist upon teaching those fundamental values and facts, and we must teach those values and those facts by relating them to the political issues that have to be considered, and both exposing whether and how those values and facts relate to proposals that are made. Because what the political branches of government do is relevant and important, we must do whatever we can to have those who would lead us recognise that our democratic institutions are more valuable, much more valuable, than those who at any moment may occupy some office in them. We must do what we can to impress upon those who seek office that power is not the objective, that having the numbers in the branch, the faction, the party, the legislature is not the end. What matters is what our democratic institutions do and how they do it. And all our democratic institutions are based upon a premise of reasoned and informed debate. Reasoned and informed debate, like leadership, depends on truth. Leaders must lead and they must teach. Zelman Cowen was a leader. As legal scholar and teacher, law school dean, university vice-chancellor, Zelman Cowen walked ahead of others and had others follow in his path. As Governor-General, he led this nation with that touch of healing that marked his term of office. And he never stopped teaching. Look at his speeches as Governor-General and you see the teacher at work. It is therefore right that this centre at Victoria University should bear his name and that this annual oration should mark his signal achievements. Zelman Cowen led because he taught. So should we all. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ken, for that extremely thought-provoking address and also that excellent tribute to Zelman Cowen at the end of your speech. We now have 15 minutes for questions, or possibly a bit longer than that, because we did start a bit late. We're adding some time on, so we're aiming to finish now about 6:20. So that gives us good time for some questions. And if you'd like to ask a question, please write it in the Q&A section, and we will read it out on your behalf. You're also free to upvote questions you would like answered. So while we're getting some questions in that way, and we're upvoting to find out what the most popular questions are, we do have a couple of our distinguished guests who've kindly agreed to ask some questions and to join us in person on screen, technology permitting. And the first such distinguished guest is Rod Sims, Chair of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. And if Rod's able to turn his camera on and join us to ask a question and prove that the technology does indeed work.
I've done that, Peter.
Well done.
Well done, you.
The floor is yours for a question. Welcome, Rod.
Thank you very much. And Thank you, Kenneth Hayne, for an excellent talk, and your point about leading by teaching, I think, is a wonderful point to make. Obviously, you were talking very much about public institutions, but you also talked about social media, algorithms, and so I couldn't help but reflect back to your excellent work at the Royal Commission and ask, what about companies? And I suppose, how much do you think society should put faith in companies to behave appropriately or as society expects, versus how much should society rely on regulators to ensure this happens? How much should responsibility lie with the companies? How much with regulators? And given my role, you can understand that's a totally self-interested question. Thank you.
I think that in the end, it's trite to say both have their role. If companies will not, regulators must do what they can to ensure that they do. I think that one thought I would inject into this aspect of the debate is that, at least for a time, there has been an idea that corporations exist for the sole purpose of enhancing shareholder value, bracket, as measured by share price from period to period, where the period is commonly very short. This, I think, is a narrow view of directors' duties. I've said publicly more than once that I think directors have broader duties than that, and that directors need and managers need to have a longer term horizon than where will the share price be and what will the profit number be 3 months or 12 months hence. I think that the role of regulators is obviously extremely difficult. If there is a breach of fundamental standards and rules, then by and large regulators will observe that and take action accordingly to bring the perpetrator to book. More interesting, though, is the ability of regulators to nudge, to point out, to lead, to return to my theme, in effect, to teach. That, no, it's not good enough to just say, my P&L next period will show a profit of X dollars, which will go 90% in dividend to shareholders. There is a broader role. So what's the divide between corporation and regulator? Ever changing, I fear.
Thank you very much.
So a very interesting answer to a very interesting question. And thanks, Rod. I'm sure you could have engaged in quite a lengthy conversation on that topic, but we will move on to our second distinguished guest, Fiona Mcclay, who of Victorian Legal Services, the Victorian Legal Services Commissioner and CEO of the Victorian Legal Services Board, to ask her question on camera. If you'd like to turn your camera on, I think it is on. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Ken Hayne, for those really thought-provoking remarks. I'm going to follow on from Rob Sims and ask another self-interested question as the regulator of the legal profession in Victoria. In a recent speech to Australia's legal regulators, Robert Fitzgerald AM reflected on his time on the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, as well as the findings of your own Royal Commission. He observed that he noticed that lawyers were often involved in the design of the legal framework that enable the conduct being examined by the Royal Commissions, or were involved in attempts to avoid accountability for this conduct. This was often conduct which, as you said in your report, in many cases had broken the law, and if not, then it had fallen short of the behaviour that the community not only expects but deserves. So my question is, do you agree that lawyers, often leaders in their community, part of a profession that's founded on reason and principle, grounded in facts, have lawyers played a part in the erosion of this public trust that you've been reflecting on? And if so, what role should they play in helping to rebuild it?
The question you ask is very deep and very important. To do justice to it, I think would take quite some time. There are 2 points I think I would want to make in answer. The first is, one of the hardest things as a lawyer, but one of the necessary skills of a lawyer, is to give what I refer to as steely-eyed advice. By that I mean the law officer advising a minister of the Crown, no minister, you may not do that. To do so would be contrary to law. Or the solicitor, the newest solicitor, who is advising her client and who has to say to the client, no, you can't do that. It's contrary to law. And I think that the second point I'd make is that there emerged at one time a view, I think, among some practitioners that their primary task was to ease the way for their client to do what their client wished to do. That's an accurate but partial statement of their obligation. And often it is incumbent on the lawyer to take one step firmly back, look at overall what is proposed and say either, no, you can't do that because it's contrary to law, or, well, you might do that and it might not be a breach of the criminal law, but I can tell you your reputation will be shot if you do it. And giving that form of steely-eyed advice takes courage. And it may see the client in a huff, gathering the papers up and storming out of the office. And that's going to make for interesting discussion at the next meeting of partners, isn't it? But there comes that time and you've got to do it. And the second point I should have made was it's about institution. Institutions of which we are members are important. I think the courts on which I had the privilege to serve play extraordinarily important roles in the government and order of our society. But I was a temporary passing figure in that. The institution mattered much more than I did. But so too, the law matters much more than the individual lawyer.
Well, thanks, Fiona, for the question, and Ken for that answer. And look, I think it's now time to go to the questions from the floor, so to speak, or from the Zoom, so to speak. And Tilly has been monitoring the questions coming in and is going to tell us, I think, what the top 2 most popular questions are, and you might read them both out, and then Ken can decide how much attention he wants to give to each of them.
Sure. Thanks very much, Peter. So the most popular question we have with 15 votes is from Katie Miller. It's quite a long question, so I might just ask that one question first, if that suits. To our distinguished orator, what are your thoughts on the increasing limitations on the ability of people to engage in public debate by virtue of their employment and the ability to engage in the teaching and debates you have suggested. Public servants, for example, face the Banerjee limitation, and private employees are required to protect the brand of their employer.
Thanks, Tilly. Yeah, that was the long question, so we'll address that one first. So over to you.
The place of the public service is I think, unique. I think there are difficulties still, even with the public service organised at state and federal level as now it is, with rather more political appointment of permanent heads. I think there are difficulties about public servants entering into immediate matters of political controversy. Those in private employ, I think, stand apart. No doubt there is an obligation on an employee to, as you put it, Katie, to protect the brand, but that may indicate the nature and content of the kind of contribution that is to be made. If it is reasoned, if it is respectful, if it is a thoughtful contribution rather than a shrill cry of a slogan, I think there is less chance, I don't say no chance, there is less chance of the employer saying, look, you're trashing my brand. And I think we've seen that in some of the larger corporate entities and their CEOs saying what they have on matters of climate change, which for so long have been matters of such hot political controversy. They have tended, I think, by and large, to make informed, thoughtful contributions, which I don't think have reflected at all on their brand. So I treat public servants, I'm sorry, Katie, I do, separately. Private employees, I think, can engage in debate according to the way in which they engage.
Yeah, okay, well, thanks, Ken. And Tilly, would you like to come with the second question?
Sure. So our second most popular question from Fiona Mcclay, SC, a little shorter than the last one. You spoke about consequences, and yet there are so few in the current political system. What do you see as the most important reforms here?
In the written text of the paper, but not in the delivery version, I think I say something to the effect that there is probably a whole week's seminar to be had on the means of dealing with departures from honest conduct by those in the public sector. We have, I think, to be better able to grapple with allegations of dishonesty than we now are. I don't feel I can offer a useful thumbnail sketch of what form that would take.
So I think we do have time for one more question before we move to the vote of thanks. So Tilly, do you want to?
Certainly. So we've got a tie for the two most popular questions, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to ask the one that was asked earlier. And that is from Abiola Ajetamobi. In a society where leadership slogans become a myth that breeds fear and anxiety, how do we hold our leaders accountable for their choice of words and the negative behavioural impacts it has caused in the treatment of others?
Do we hold them accountable, or should we hold them accountable, is the question, Tilly.
The question is, how do we? But I suppose both questions are relevant. Yes, should and how.
Yeah.
It is, I think, if I may say so, a subset of the more general point I was trying to make, that leaders will depart from relying on slogans. Leaders will act in a fashion which we regard as acceptable only if there are consequences that are seen as attaching to departure from generally accepted standards of conduct and behaviour. The most immediate form of consequence, of course, remains for elected officials, loss at the ballot box. That is, I know, both a blunt instrument and an instrument that is delayed in its application. But I think it remains not only the only means of holding the political branches accountable, I think it is probably the best form of holding the political branches accountable. It is a blunt instrument, applied infrequently, but that I think is the best we have, or the least worst we have.
Yes, indeed, and I think a good note on which to end, and some hopefully faith in our democratic institutions, and that's, I think, the end of a really fascinating evening from my point of view. A wonderful oration and some great Q&A. But it's now my honour to welcome to the stage Karen Marlab, AM, the chair of the Cowen Centre, to deliver the vote of thanks on behalf of the Centre and the University, and Karen will also close the proceedings.
Thank you, Peter. I am not on mute, so that's all good. Ken, thank you for such an inspiring and thoughtful oration, with many questions arising and most of them not easily answered. As you clearly argued, grappling at a national level with the truths around the issues you highlighted, Indigenous recognition and voice, climate change, and ensuring the proper workings of our democracy is a big task, but really fundamental to our future and our values as Australians. To lead by teaching the why is a challenge to all who do lead at this time. And thank you so much for that message. Hopefully some of the learnings from this COVID period, where science, national collaboration and the speed at which policy can pivot will have lessons, as you say, for the future. Thank you again for your vision. The Zelman Cowen Centre annual oration provides the opportunity for thought leaders, such as you, Ken, to engage with an influential audience, many of who are connected to the legal profession, academia and government. The Zelman Cowen Centre annual oration provides the opportunities for thought. We're so pleased that you agreed to speak tonight and that we can include you in the list of very distinguished alumni of SZCC orators, all of who can be seen, by the way, along with other significant work the Centre does on our website. A link to the oration will shortly be sent out to you all, and I noticed in the chat that the Australian Financial Review has already got the oration published online. Such is the speed at which we move these days, even from our own homes. Can I thank Professor Kathy Laster and her small but really perfectly formed team at the Centre for organising this memorable virtual gathering on, as Peter Dawkins noted, critical questions at this time. In more together times, we present you, Ken, with an inscribed medallion. However, at the moment, a bottle of wine will arrive to you shortly. to make these days pass more quickly. But thank you again. On behalf of Victoria University and the Zelman Cowen Centre, I'd like to say thank you to you all for attending, and in particular a shout out to Lady Anna Cowen, Sir Zelman's wife and partner, and to the rest of the Cowen family listening tonight. We wish you, your families and your organisations all the best for the coming weeks and months, and we hope to see you at next year's Cowen Centre Oration in person. Thank you for joining us, and good evening.